So welcome back. Let's see. I think this is session 7. So we're on the downward swing of the workshop, and I think this is the last session that I will present. And this one talks about the sustainment of effective teams, as you guys could see through the agenda. And start my timer here. So when we thought about this, and when I thought about this session, I kind of took it a little bit broad. And so we're going to talk about 3 things. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how teams develop. And Chris mentioned this a little bit yesterday. He talked about some team development frameworks that are out there. I'm going to talk briefly about them because they're important when we start thinking about how we want to intervene, because if I have an awareness of how teams develop, it alerts me not only in some senses when I should be intervening with these interventions, but also what are the challenges that are likely to pop up in my team at different points in time. The second thing I'll talk a little bit about is, what we really care about probably is, what can I do to maximize team effectiveness? So here I'm going to highlight some of those, go into a little bit of detail on some of those interventions that I just threw up at the end of the slide deck on the first day. And then lastly, I'm going to kind of pull out a specific intervention that I think is really useful. It's got a lot of evidence behind it, and it can be used for a wide variety of team processes. So we'll talk about team debriefs a little bit. So a little bit about team development. So there are a number of frameworks out there that talk about how teams develop over time. 2 kind of foundational ones, I guess, are the work of Tuckman, which you see kind of here on the left-hand side. And if you read anything about teams and team development, you've probably seen this because this is standard in all of our psychology books and outward from there. And then the second one you see on this right-hand side, and this is some work by Gersick. And they take a little bit different of an approach, but they're both informative when we start thinking about how we can work to sustain, and I'll say sustainment broadly, teams. Let me go into a little bit more detail on both of these. So Tuckman's, like I said, this has been around forever. And the idea here is it's known as the stage model. And the idea is that teams go through 5 different stages that each represent different types of challenges as they're moving through their lifespan. This first came out, it was viewed as being very linear, saying that, once you move past the stage, you never went and revisited it. Well, we know that that's not the case anymore. And teams do oscillate back and forth between stages. Just make sure that's for me. Okay, sorry. So when we're first putting our team together, what we're talking about is, they start with a forming stage. And here, the challenges and what they're looking for guidance on really are, why are we here? What are we doing? What are our goals? What are our purposes? So interventions that focus around those things are going to be especially beneficial there. What you tend to see during this stage is, a little bit of uncertainty among team members. If you have anybody on the team that has an assertive personality, you generally see those people begin to step up and begin to take on some leadership roles. Sometimes they're good things, sometimes they're not, but that kind of begins to happen. As we begin to move forward, after the team begins to understand kind of this is what we're here for and this is my purpose and my goals, then we move towards kind of this storming stage where members, they still view themselves as individuals and they don't really think of themselves as a team yet, but they're feeling a little bit more comfortable. So this is when you see the conflict begin to raise its head, where people may begin vying for positions. They may be communicating their feelings about, particular issues a little bit more so than they would, when you first kind of put your initial group together. So here, issues related to conflict management and what can members do to make sure that the conflict that does begin to appear is focused on the task and it's productive and it doesn't degrade into kind of interpersonal conflict that serves to hurt the team. As you move forward, we get to the norming phase, and this is kind of a lot of what, citing some of what Chris had talked about before. This is really the phase where the team's beginning to set up their norms for operation. So now I view myself as a team, and we really begin focusing on what are the shared norms and procedures that we want to use and that we're going to enact within this team. And you also see cohesion start to form here and cooperation. So things like the charters and reinforcement of those charters are excellent there. Once they get past norming, then we move into, kind of now they're on task, right? And they're doing hopefully they're doing some of those processes and those emergent states, the cohesion and shared mental models, and that stuff is continuing to form and to drive their behaviors and their coordinated activities during that stage. And then the last thing we have so let me back up. So a lot of our interventions kind of come into play during that performing period of time. And then we have, adjourning. So the team's going to leave. If the team performed well, you might see some sadness, some happiness with, how they performed and accomplished their goals, the impact that they have, if we're talking about an implementation team, maybe. However, the reason that I put it here and I'm even talking about it right now is because it's very important to understand that no matter, if your team is going to be working together again down the line, it's a research team, or maybe you're going to do a different project with your community partners down the line. It's important to kind of reflect on what went well, what maybe didn't go so well, and areas of improvement. But even if your team's not going to work together again and they're going to disperse, it's also important to recognize that how things went within this team will impact how the expectations that your team members are going to have as they rotate into a new team. The other model, Gersich's model here, takes a little bit different perspective. So this one talks more about timing with
Hey, Sean, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we can't hear you.
We lost your audio, Sean.
Sean, do you want to try calling in maybe? Are you on your phone audio? We still can't hear you.
that team is going to be working together, that their impressions and what happened on the team that they're on is going to feed into how they work on their next team and the perceptions of their next team. If your team is going to be working together again, the importance of kind of doing this a debrief about what went well and what didn't go well becomes even more important. The next type of development model that I wanted to highlight is Gersich's model. And here the example, here when we talk about time, it's really about the task and how long your task period is, right? So you can think about, I'm writing a proposal. That proposal is going to take me 6 weeks. I've already got my academic and my community partners. We're working together on this proposal. Now I'm paranoid, hold on. Just make sure this isn't that you guys can't hear me again.
You're good, you're good.
Okay, all right. And so the team starts working together, they're working however they're working. About the midpoint between when they started and their deadline, there's this natural tendency to kind of reflect on your strategy, to reflect on, hey, we've got, how are we progressing in terms of meeting our goal, and how are we progressing on kind of working together. So Gersich talks about this is midpoint transition. And likely at this point, what you see is if the team is going to change their strategy, this is where they're going to do it. And they continue kind of working after that towards, the end of this task cycle. So I bring this up now because the midpoint is another place where teams are naturally receptive to some of these interventions and to some of these, gaining coaching or feedback. All right. And kind of tying back to that, I mentioned this yesterday. This ties in really nicely when we're thinking about cycles and stuff like that. So we talked yesterday about coaching and whether it's done internally or through the use of a formal external coach. In this sense, what I'm going to talk about really doesn't matter. But the idea here is that, if I'm just starting on my task, the type of coaching that we would want here is motivational stuff, coaching that addresses the effort and is trying to make sure that we still have that shared commitment to the group and its work. And this might be especially important if your team's been working together for a while and they kind of, they're starting a new task and maybe commitments tending to, to wane a little bit for one reason or another. You can come in with this motivational coaching. At the midpoint transition is when the team is going to be most receptive to coaching that deals with their performance strategy. So how they're working together and making sure that they're not getting into kind of this mindless routine because now they've been working together for a while, but they are really kind of thinking about back and assessing how they're doing. And then lastly, at the end of your task, it's done, we now have time. That's when we see recommendations about doing the type of coaching that's really structured and focused on, knowledge and skill and this more formal kind of debriefing. So I just wanted to highlight how some of those things are useful. All right. So kind of getting into the meat of it, now that we know that there are some different challenges that teams face according to kind of where they're at, what can we do about it? So when we talk about team development interventions, and there are a ton of them, and I'm only going to touch on probably 3 or 4 of them here, but when we think about team development, we can think about it in 3 or 4 different ways, right? So we can use it to support teams that may be struggling or they're failing. So something's happened and they're just not gelling anymore. They're not working. They're not coordinating together very well. It could be a new member coming in. It could be that something stressful happened to the team. I mean, it's a number of things that could be causing it. We can also use team development interventions for sustaining teams once they're adequately performing, but we don't want them to drop off. And there are going to be times team performance fluctuates. No one's going to be great all the time. And then the third area that we can use these in is we want to push our team. We want to stretch them and push their capabilities. And when we talk about team development, they tend to be classified broadly into 2 big areas. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. We do know there's a lot of evidence for a lot of different types of team development interventions, and we know that they facilitate important team outcomes under a couple conditions. And some of these are going to seem very kind of, well, of course, but sometimes we take these things for granted. So the first one is that there's a focus on a real team relevant need, right? So what we don't want is for people to find a hammer and think everything, team development interventions can fix everything, because they can't. It needs to be something that really is being driven by a decrement in team process or some type of emergent cognitive or affective state. So if an individual on my team doesn't have in their area of expertise, for example, this isn't going to help. If the team is working well itself, but they're embedded within an organization, an academic, within a particular community, and there's some impediment at that level above them, these interventions that I'm going to talk about probably aren't going to help that much, because some of that's out of the team's hands. Let's see what else. Here's the obvious one. It needs to involve the active engagement of the team. Well, of course it does. They're the focus of the intervention here. However, what may be less obvious sometimes is that when those interventions are being developed and when we are making decisions about which ones to focus on, it really needs to be done in conjunction with others that either have knowledge of the team, right? We need to be able to diagnose what the problem is before we know how we can help it. And then lastly, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, given who's on this webinar today, but it needs to be implemented by a systematic set of strategies and tools. So it can't be done haphazardly. So, based on the evidence that's out there. And when we talk about interventions, this slide's really talking about training interventions, but the point I want to make still sticks, that we have a combination of tools and methods that we use, and they combine to form our strategies. And for teams, one of the ones that we haven't talked about at all that I want to highlight is on the tool side, and it's this notion of doing a team task analysis. It's very similar to if you're in the area where you develop training programs. It's very similar to what you would do on an individual level in the sense that you're trying to identify the tasks that the teams perform. You know, what are the knowledges, the skills, the attitudes and abilities that are needed. But what becomes important on the team side is which of those things require the teams to be coordinated. So which tasks is it that the teams really have to be interdependent on? Because chances are, even when you're working within the team, not everything I do am I coordinating with everybody. So beginning to understand that and where those gaps are helps to drive what interventions to focus on. And then, you know, on the method side, most of these strategies involve some combination. There's almost always, you know, information, didactic kind of information. And then we're in some way or shape or form, we're modeling the behavior that we want to be seen within these interventions. Sometimes that's through video, sometimes it's through, you know, it can be through role play. We can also do guided practice.
Your sound cut out.
Can you hear me again?
Now you're back, yeah.
Now you're back.
Okay. All right, awesome. Yeah, I get a weird sound on my phone when it goes away, so maybe that's my cue now. When I'm thinking about what interventions to use, you know, a couple of questions that are going through my mind. You know, what is the actual need? Am I building? Am I sustaining? You know, do we have, you know, a motivational problem here? And that's going to help me to drive the exact intervention I'm looking at. You know, who's involved? Who needs it? Is it the entire team? Is it part of the team? Who's involved in helping me to implement that team development intervention? Right? Who do I need to be talking to? When is it needed? That goes back to our life cycle kind of things. And then how am I going to implement it? And sometimes that's driven by the constraints of the team itself or, you know, the organizations that they're embedded within. So with that being said, I'm going to kind of jump into some of these interventions. So the first one, like I said, is team building. This intervention's been around for a really long time. You know, early on, the focus really was, and I guess to some extent it still is on building the interpersonal relationships within the team. So trust development, resolution of conflict, those type of interactions. It's still really the focus here. More recently, what we've seen, and this is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, is that team building interventions that work well, because not all do, are going to have some subset of these characteristics. So the idea of goal setting and role clarification are really big, and you're going to see in a minute that most of the team building interventions that are successful have some component of this. And I think part of that reason is if we're setting our goals and we're clarifying our roles, guess what? There's probably naturally less conflict. But some of these things are simple, and you know they're the cheesy things that we don't like to think about. But spending time, finding a shared activity, you know, that team members can do together to begin to build trust with one another and establish some of those common connections. And sometimes it's very simple. But generally, team building interventions are not meant to promote skill development. They're mostly focused more on that kind of affective, interpersonal dimension. We do know that they improve team outcomes. This meta-analysis is fairly old. I think it's time for someone to probably go out and do a new one. But we know that they impact cognitive, behavioral, that's the process, and affective outcomes. However, they tend to impact process and affect most. And I highlighted this a few minutes ago, so we know that team building interventions that have goal setting and role clarification components tend to be the most effective. And then large teams tend to benefit from them more than small teams. Well, that makes sense because when you have large teams, there's more complexity, right? So there's more things that need to be clarified and refined. Okay. Team charters, Chris did this the other day. I'm not going to go into this at all. I just want to bring up that this is an example of a team building intervention. The other thing I want to clarify here is Chris talked about it as being done at the beginning. You know, he said it could be revisited. It should be revisited at multiple points, because as teams, our goals change, our values change. You know, new members might integrate in and out, but the environment might change, which might change how we need to approach things. Team training. The other big class is everything else kind of falls under team training. And I tried to put references down here at the bottom that you guys can go to and learn more information. But this slide has a lot of words on it, but basically team training interventions are those that tend to be focused on those processes that you've heard us talking about: the communication, the coordination, decision-making, leadership. So all those team processes. Sometimes they focus on some of the emergent states, but usually I focus on the emergent states to get to the processes. So let me talk about a few of these. So there are a whole host of interventions. These are just a sampling of them. So the first one here, cross-training, this really is focusing on building shared knowledge of your task and responsibility. So the idea is you're working here to build shared mental models, because those shared mental models not only help with coordination, but then they also help team members to engage in mutual performance monitoring and backup behaviors, because they better understand what everybody's roles and responsibilities are. So cross-training at its simplest form can be didactic, literally just going over what everybody on the team, what their roles and responsibilities are. So I have a better understanding of where those coordination points are and what type of information those people might need or might be able to offer me. So it's really working on building shared mental models there in transactive memory systems. At its most complex, it's putting people, almost like a job rotation, putting people into the actual jobs of their teammates for a small portion of time, so they actually get to perform that job for a little bit of time. And again, it serves the same purpose. It also tends to build empathy. But the complexity, and in many cases, we don't go all the way to that full scale, because that's not what's needed. In many cases, it's just that awareness and of what others members' tasks and stuff are. Team self-correction is another one that's got a fair amount of evidence. This is similar to team debriefing, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the goal here is really to develop the team's ability to self-diagnose their framework. So you're trying to promote regulation capabilities, the team to kind of be their own coach, if you will. It can be framed to focus around a lot of different team processes. However, what you see emphasized a lot are mutual performance monitoring, effective communication, and then leadership skills. Team coordination and crew resource management, to me, share a lot of similarities. So they're both trying to improve the mechanisms that allow teams to actually do that coordination. So with team coordination training, you see a lot of, you're trying to improve your shared mental model framework to get at, so I have a better understanding of, when can I help somebody out? When can I back people up? And kind of that understanding of teamwork skills. So that label of team coordination training captures a lot of different things. If you can argue that it contributes to coordination, it can kind of fall under that bucket. Crew resource management training is something that came out of aviation. I'm trying to see where I am with time real quick. It came out of aviation, has migrated into many communities, including the medical community, and it's really focused on building teamwork. So in its original form, it focused on communication, the importance of conducting a short brief up front. So you can kind of think of the team charter stuff. What's my purpose? What's my goals? Backup behaviors, decision-making, issues around team adaptability. And then because it came out of aviation, shared situation awareness. Am I paying attention to what's going on in my environment, and how does that impact what I'm doing as a team? Within the medical community, if you're familiar with the Team Steps program, that's kind of an indication. That's a modified version of what this is. And I know I'm over because of my thing, but get through a couple slides on the team debrief. The debriefs are very, very powerful. They're a structured intervention on experiences. They ask the team to reflect back on their task performance, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. They have been shown to improve performance up to 25%, which is huge when we're talking about behavioral, at least in our field, behavioral interventions. We usually don't see that much of an improvement at once. And they can be used in real time, or they can be used within a training context. For the community that we're talking about here, it's probably more useful in a real time kind of standpoint. What makes them effective on this? I put the citation down here at the bottom, but Scott Tannenbaum is kind of the guy to go to and look for. Is kind of the leader in this area. What makes them effective? So you're specifically relying on a culture of active self-learning. So these things don't work. We put that up. They don't work if there's not a psychologically safe environment for the team, because it all hinges on the fact that you don't want your leader or your coach or whoever's leading it to get up there and tell the team what's going well, what's going right. But it really is the foundational thing here is that the team owns this. They're engaging and they're very actively involved. They reflect on what went well, what perhaps they need, areas of needed improvement, and then, how they kind of an action plan for that improvement. It's very important that it's made clear that these are for developmental purposes, non-punitive, or else it also doesn't work. And you focus on specific events. And that's what makes it powerful, is it's not this global, hey, what went well? But you could recall, if you were doing a proposal or something, you could recall either if you note specific events, and sometimes from a training standpoint, you can do that. But you can also think about, like with a proposal, hey, what did we do good in the initial brainstorming portion of it? But you can think of your task and kind of divide it up and then draw down to specific events from there. In order to kind of make these work, as with anything else, people have good intentions, but people get busy. So guidance, schedule a regular time and place to do these things so it becomes a habit for the team. The creation of a learning environment, I already talked about that with the psychological safety. And then you can review, kind of these 4 questions. What are we trying to accomplish? What did we hit? So this is just another way of reframing what I just said, but what did we hit or miss? And in talking about that, and in talking about what you should, what should we start, stop, or continue doing, right? That kind of leads me to my action plan and getting there. Why did we have these issues? We have 2 more slides. So the literature has shown that facilitated debriefs are 3 times more effective than non-facilitated. So you want that structure there. You want someone there that can move the team along if they get bogged down. Again, like I said, you have to discuss both the positive, negative, and it depends on the climate of psychological safety. Claire, do I have a couple more minutes, or do you want me to stop?
Keep going, Sean. You have a couple minutes.
Okay. So I put this slide up here. This is a really busy slide, and I stole it from the Shuffler et al. Paper. But I'm going to see if I can do this as a wrap-up slide here, as a way to wrap up a lot of what Chris and I have talked about over the last 1.5 days. So if you look at the top here, what you see that input, process, output model that we talked about. So on the input side is the recognition that when we're talking about teams, you have the individual team members, so they impact the team, right? And that team is also embedded within an organizational context. And we think about all that when we think about what are the things that impact how a team performs. Then we have the middle part, which is for the processes and the emergent states that you've heard us talk probably ad nauseum about at this point. And that's the teamwork. That's how they're working to accomplish their task objectives. And then those processes and states lead to particular performance outcomes. And all of this is dynamic. If that's one thing you should take away from here, everything's dynamic. It feeds back into, the next tasks they're going to do, the next team they're going to be on, and that serves to kind of change things as we move along. We don't do a good job studying it dynamically, which I think Chris and I both have made a point of, but it is dynamic. What you see, if you go down to where it says emphasis of developmental needs, this is these authors trying to take the approach at, if I'm beginning to form my team, The inputs that I'm worried about are things that are dealing with commitment, the setting of roles, the development of norms. As we're working through and we're beginning to, the team's working, now they're doing their teamwork, if you will, I'm focused on clarifying those role interactions, shared responsibility, and the building and maintaining of those mental models that are serving to drive coordinative activities. As I move, my team's now been together for a while, so I'm worried about sustaining and improving. Now we have what you heard Chris talk about with the charters, right? I need to revisit things. Are there any role or norm adjustments that need to be made? Did we have a membership change? We're working together on the task now. Focuses tend to be on problem solving, conflict management. What can we do to facilitate backup behavior within these teams so that we can really take advantage of the fact that we have all these multiple resources available to us. And on the output side, you see things begin to reflect team reflection, learning, and deficiency recognition. And then as we get to maximizing, so now I want to push my teams past where they are. And, it's about what can we do to make our teams resilient? How can we begin to empower them with some self-management? And you see a focus here on, implicit coordination, which deals with, the shared mental models allow that. Adaptation, shared leadership, I think, comes into play also at this point, because again, it's another way to build capacity within the team. At the bottom here, we've got the team development interventions. On the left-hand side, this is that blue line. On the left-hand side, you see things that we often talk about on the front end. So what are things that I can do early on? The charters. I can mess with team composition. I can do this task analysis to help me identify what are the issues and where are the coordination requirements so I can better train my team on where those are. I can design the work differently. Once they're performing, then it's really about team performance monitoring assessment. And if you look right underneath that, you just see it says multifaceted team development interventions. And that's because once they start performing, then we generally don't go in, and they probably don't need training on all the teamwork capabilities, right? But you go in and you're focusing and saying, okay, we have a real need for leadership training here or coordination training here. So it's more of this more focused intervention there. And then on the end, you've got the team debriefs, the coaching and the team leadership. That can be, the end of a task cycle. That's what I was suggesting. Anyway, at the end of the task cycle, when the team has some downtime, that's what you're focusing on. So takeaway message, be aware. You don't need to know like the labels and stuff for the team development phases, but they can provide an indication of when it's best to intervene, as well as what are the likely challenges that you might face at different stages, and you might be able to be proactive and come in and mitigate these before they actually emerge. The timing of an intervention is important, right? So you can have the best intervention, but if the team's not ready to get it, it's not going to work. And there's a ton of evidence-based tools. We tried to put some of those resources in the workbook for you guys, that you could read more about some of these. And like I said, I hope that you can see that the team debriefs can be structured around processes, around emergent states, whatever the team is having a problem with. It's just it's a structure and a format that can be used across a wide variety of issues. And I'm done.